Today's guest is Shea Belsky, who is an autistic self-advocate and changemaker. He is the Chief Technology Officer of Mentra, an inclusive hiring platform connecting neurodivergent job seekers with gainful employment opportunities. Shea brings several unique perspectives to the discussion of neurodiversity. He is a manager of neurodivergent and neurotypical employees, has reported to neurodivergent and neurotypical managers, and has advocated for the needs and well-being of all who seek to be heard and understood in the workplace. So Shay, thank you very much for being on. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Drosko, thank you again for having me. I've done career coaching before, but live coaching on the air is pretty new to me. But I got your message. I was pretty excited to dive in. I've loved a lot of what you do, and I'm really eager to be here. Thank you again for having me.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. Happy to have you here. So, I know we spoke a bit about, what it is that you're kind of hoping to get out of this experience today, off air. So I'd love for you to kind of break down, essentially how I can best support you today, and we can kind of start it off from there.
Sure. So to set the scene, I am Shea Belsky. I am Chief Technology Officer at Mentra. We're a 10-person startup. I am CTO, and I manage 4 software engineers, 3 full-time, 1 part-time. I've been a people manager for about 2 years at this point, and I've done other sorts of mentoring, support, people management support, but full-on people management is a pretty new skill to me within the last 2 years. And within those last 2 years, that comes with the challenge of having good conversations and tough conversations. How do you talk to somebody about a conversation or a topic that's going to be a difficult thing for them to have a conversation about? My being autistic certainly implicates that and makes it interesting. Not explicitly better or worse, but in the sense of I would consider myself to be a risk avoidant person and confrontation avoidant person. I try not to confront people or get angry or get upset about something. And when I do have to communicate something that's difficult, I have a tendency to kind of mince words or maybe not communicate the full emotion of what I'm trying to say. And I definitely attribute that to my neurodiversity. It's a very interesting confluence of having the right words to say and then doing it in the right way. How you say something is often as important as what you say. And what I would love to get out of our conversation today is helping me figure out what is the right balance of what to say and how to say it, in the sense of making sure that whoever I'm talking with feels the impact and the understanding of what I'm trying to say in just the right way, not too harsh and not unharsh enough.
Got it. Okay, perfect. So, I mean, I think the first thing that I would just want to kind of contextualize is like, regardless of whether you're neurodivergent or not, I think this is something that a lot of people actually struggle with. I think a fear of confrontation and hard conversations and keeping people accountable and holding up the mirror, like these are skills that a lot of people struggle with. And even looked up stats, it's like something like 46% of managers like have trouble keeping people accountable. So I just wanted to kind of like normalize the experience that, well, certainly, like I think you're going to bring a unique perspective to it because of who you are. um it's a much more common problem than I think maybe it's talked about or that people would care to admit. um
That's validating.
yeah, that's exactly why I want to just kind of set the stage, because I think it's nobody prepares you for it, and a lot of the world kind of celebrates all of the qualities that you kind of repress in order to get to where you are. And then suddenly you become a manager and you're like, well, suddenly I have to like do the exact opposite of what got me here, what got me to be good, what got me to be nice, etc. That's usually kind of where my coaching goes when we do stuff like this. So anyway, um, there's a few things that you had mentioned kind of at the beginning. Okay, so how do I have difficult conversation? I tend to be risk avoidant. I tend to avoid confrontation. I mince my words. I don't convey the full emotion of what I want to say. So it's like you're pretty self-aware with regards to how all of this manifests for you. So one of the places I always start is like, okay, well, if it's 50-50 in terms of like there's two people or whatever, it can be two or more people, but let's just say there's like your 50% that you bring to the interaction, there's the other 50% that's the other, okay, whether it's
Right,
other people or the other
right.
person. At the end of the day, we always want to start with the 50% that's ours because we have full control over that, or at least we can work to have full control over that.
We
And
can
if
do
we can
something about
optimize
it.
our 50%, then it's like all of the things that I've needed to do are now covered. Now I can make more objective reactions to the other party, depending on what happens. So just before I go on, how does all of that land with you?
I definitely recognize that there's only so much that I can do in many of these situations. No matter how much I do, no matter how much time I spend thinking about what I'm going to say, how I say it, something could happen that's completely not what I expect. The other person could be like, "Oh yeah, sure, okay," and we have a great conversation. They could completely shut down and reject and start being super defensive or deflecting. I think a lot of it does depend on what can I say and do, what can I act in, what way can I behave in to, as much as possible, influence the outcome that I'm trying to achieve. Because sometimes it's easy for me to get to where I want to be, but I found that for the most part, it's very, very hard to make anybody do anything that I need them to do unless I very explicitly tell them to do. And even as a people manager, I don't necessarily love telling the people, you have to do this thing or you must do this thing. I provide a lot of guidance and support and structure into getting them to go where I think they have to go, and by communicating that in that way. But very rarely do I say you have to do this thing, you must do it this specific way. I give people a lot of latitude in that regards, which could lead to sometimes things not going over the way that they should have been done in the first place.
Yeah, and I agree that is always it's not a science, it's definitely an art and a balancing act, like you said at the beginning. So, um, when it comes to your 50%, right? Like we're gonna start looking at that piece firstly. So, do you ever have the experience of like, well, so let's say if we're talking about the avoidant aspects, like the confrontation or like really saying what it is that I wanted to say. Like after the interaction is done, do you have times when you're like, oh, I should have said this, or I was wanting to say this, but I didn't really say that? Like, do you have those types of experiences?
I definitely have times where I reflect internally and I'm like, I wish I had said this in this way. I know that I will do that next time.
Hmm.
I do spend a lot of time kind of uh, quarterbacking my own conversations to figure out what did I want to say, what did I actually say, and how close were they. And sometimes I end up feeling not necessarily happy, but satisfied that I feel like I communicated what I felt had to be communicated. And whether or not the other person understood it is a different story. But at least I felt as though I communicated my points in the manner that I needed to and as best I was able to. And sometimes that doesn't happen. Sometimes there's any number of things. I could be having a bad day. I might be not thinking about something, or I just kind of shoot from the hip and say something that I don't necessarily mean. And then that comes back to bite me if I misfire or misspeak, and then maybe have to walk something back or correct myself or follow up with something. Ideally, I don't have to do any of those things, but I have found that sometimes a bit of follow up or course correction is sometimes, but I wouldn't necessarily say often is necessary. It's definitely less than half the time in those situations, but it does happen.
Got it. Okay. So that doesn't sound like it's that big of an issue, right? In terms of like I want to say X, but I always end up saying Y, and it's not like I have a hard time expressing what it is that I ultimately want. It's just more a matter of tweaking it so it lands better. Like that's kind of what I'm hearing from you. Is that correct?
It's the landing. It's I know what I want to say, and I think it's fine. It's the brain telling the tongue what to say, and then the tongue actually doing its job if the heart has enough guts to do it. There's the matter of how do I communicate my point effectively enough, not too well where I scare somebody or intimidate them, but not weak enough where I didn't necessarily communicate the impact or importance of a conversation. For example, here's a very simple example, like an engineering work or an engineering project which was supposed to have been pushed to production at this date, it got delayed, and the delay was not communicated. And on one hand, I can just like, oh, like it's okay, we can take care of it. It's all right if it's a little bit delayed. On the other hand, there might be people who are relying on that feature being out at a certain time for marketing efforts or data analytics or some other reasons. And on one hand, I don't just want to say it's okay. On the other hand, I don't want to make this individual feel like they feel awful or really bad about it. But I do need to impress upon them the importance of communicating that something will be late and why, and understanding why that happens so we can avoid it. And I think that's kind of where I'm struggling.
Got it. So what's your internal experience of that push pull? Kind of like, because what I'm hearing is like there's some dissonance between delivering this bad news. So what is your internal dissonance? Like, well, what is happening for you internally when you're in that situation?
The the conflict that's happening is that I don't want to dissuade or intimidate somebody from taking on leadership projects in the future. Like, I want to grow my engineers to be leaders, to own their work, and feel confident that they can reasonably estimate how long something will take. They can own it end to end. They can have a really good idea and a really good belief in themselves to accomplish something. And I feel like if I come in and kind of shoot them down or demotivate them, then they're not going to want to do the things in the future. That's, I think, the Jekyll and Hyde conversation that happens to me, the push and the pull. It's I want people to feel like they could take on leadership, but I don't want to necessarily shield them, I guess, from the fallout if it doesn't go well. Is a severe word. Shield them from the impact if it doesn't go well. Probably a better way to phrase that.
Got it. Okay. So internally, basically your struggle is I want them to like I want to nurture in them this leadership capability and to own, that they can do great things and to own that they kind of believe in themselves. And I want to make sure that I nurture that by not crushing it with the delivery of the sort of like bad news or whatever. Like, is that accurate?
Yeah, like bad news, like tough conversations. Like I don't want them to feel like they can't do this again if it doesn't go over well once. Like this may be their first time doing a project. It might be their 20th time doing a project. And the success of subsequent projects is built off of their confidence and success coming out of the last one. And if I kind of crush their dreams on any one of those, it certainly makes you put a pause on things, or
Mhm.
it prompts them to kind of look inward and ask, is this for me? And I've had the conversation with them about that. It's like, is this for me if I can't even keep this straight? And that's where I think I really struggle. It's kind of evolving what you said. It's like evolving them past their own point of dissonance, I think.
Got it. And so this isn't just like the example that you used about, okay, well, we're going to be late on this, like shipping this particular feature. This is also ownership of like deliverables. So like you said, you were going to do this, or the quality of work was going to be like at this level. So like, are you talking about all of those things as well?
It's a little bit of everything.
Okay.
It's the A deadline is a simple example, but it could be like somebody said that they were going to do this part of the project or that it would have this functionality. And then when it goes to production after we QA it, we're like, oh, this piece of it is missing. How come that's a little bit more complicated about
Mhm.
like it's I feel like it's a communication thing or understanding where the communication dropped.
Got it. Okay.
And
So
go ahead, sorry.
yeah, so like to say if we're going in that instance, like what I'm hearing is part of it is okay, so this person or this team or whatever was responsible for the rollout of this particular feature by this particular date, and then the date comes and it's not exactly there. So now we kind of have to play catch up and buffer against that. Like that's kind of one scenario.
Yeah, like on the one hand, I could just kind of like corner them and say, "Hey, what's going on?" But I feel as like I'm cornering someone in an alley and asking them for their wallet. It sounds very hostile in my head when I played it out in my mind that way.
Hmm.
What I instead, I do need to have a confrontation, and I think that is the appropriate severity for the word I'm looking for. But what matters a lot to me is what is the point in me having this conversation, this confrontation? What do I need to get out of it, and what do they need to take away from it?
Got it. Okay, so I think the first part that I would just be more curious about is your definition or worldview around particular things. So you had mentioned here towards the beginning, I want to nurture in my team this leadership thing that they can kind of go like forward, that they have ownership of things. Uh, Basically, I want to nurture in them this kind of self sense of responsibility and accountability that they can do big things. Is that accurate with regards to your desire and what you want to do for the team?
Yeah, I think that plays well into the conflict resolution side of things because if people feel confident and supported in their decision-making process, whether it's successful or there's a conflict, then I think that, in my opinion, they'll feel a lot better about taking on more roles, more leadership, more autonomy, knowing that they will not be held over the fire if something goes wrong, but there is a sense of, I think the word I'm looking for is accountability.
Right. So, can you have accountability without any sort of scrutiny or mirroring?
When you say mirroring, what do you mean by that?
Mirroring, as in, you said you were going to deliver this. Right now, you delivered something that's not this by this date. What now? Right? Like
I,
there has to be a level of mirroring of what was agreed upon.
when I think of accountability, I think of like, you said you were going to do this, but you actually did something else instead.
Hmm.
Where did that discrepancy come from? Can we explain it? Can we fix it if it's fixable?
Hmm.
And going forward, can we become aware of these discrepancies in the future? That way we can plan around them or just be aware of them. That way they don't catch us by surprise. I think the word that comes to my mind there is a surprise. Less about the fact that there was a discrepancy and more that in this case there wasn't a communication of it.
Right.
That's what I think is coming to my mind.
And do you think the lack of communication is coming from the other person or from yourself?
It could be a little bit of both. I think when I ask my engineers to lead projects, sometimes I'm the one driving the communication, the status updates, the 411 about it. Other times it's them doing the communication, the status updates, the 411. I think it varies based on the project. And sometimes I think maybe there is a gray line as to, okay, who's doing the managerial, the kind of back of house side of things, and who's doing the front of house communication, people pleasing meeting side of things. I, upon reflecting, that can sometimes be a gray area.
Right. So I understand that like process is going to be a big thing, like how the process of communication actually happens. And I think like that's its own discussion. I think in this instance, we just want to focus on the personal bit. So if we go back to the whole accountability piece, right? So it's like right now what I'm hearing is like simultaneously, I want people to be essentially self-accountable, meaning if you say you're going to deliver this thing, then I want you to try to deliver it. If you don't deliver it, I want you to communicate to me that it hasn't been like it's not going to be delivered. So I simultaneously want to nurture self-accountability while also buffering them from the stings that naturally come from accountability. So when I reflect that back, what comes up for you?
I don't know if I want to keep them insulated from all of the stings, like you said. In my opinion, I think part of being a good leader is to feel a little bit of that sting. Like I think this was talked about before. It's like how much do I want them to feel the impact of this? Not too much where they've completely get their hand burned and never do it again, but not enough where they don't realize that what they're doing is a bad thing or could cause them or other people some pain or discomfort or cause things to not work out so well. The analogy that comes to my mind is like you learn how to ride a bike and you fall and you get back up and you try again and then eventually you don't fall after riding for a couple of after you don't fall after riding for a little bit. I want to teach them how to ride a bike and it's okay if they fall. And but I want to help them get back up and eventually they should be able to ride on their own without me pushing them, I guess, by their back.
Right. And to what degree are you comfortable watching them fall?
That's a hard question. I I have to have some level of comfort with watching them fall. It's painful. It's tough to watch somebody do something that's going to not end well, watching it happen in slow motion almost.
Right.
At the same time, I
So
can't
just
do
to
it for them all the time.
pause right there, right? So you're perfectly describing the process or like the intellectual understanding of watching somebody fall, right? But it's like the original question was, well, how comfortable are you with letting people fall? Because the only way they're actually going to learn is through the falling. They're not going to learn through the successes. So the reason that I asked that question is because the balance about what you're asking for, right? Where is that sweet spot between I'm communicating something so that it's constructively taken, but I'm not crushing their dreams. The first part of that is actually your own feelings around delivering something that's going to hurt people. So, like, if a part of you has a hard time with other people not being okay, especially if you are the cause of that, that's always going to be a distortive lens through which you're going to view the communication. So, what comes up when I reflect that back?
It's definitely a challenge for me. Like in that communication style, it's certainly where my neurodiversity comes up. It's being able to say something, knowing what I have to say, and then actually going out and saying it are two very different things. And I think my brain has a good time being able to recognize I know what I have to do. But the emotional side, the heart, the soul, has a tough time actually ripping off that band-aid and doing it. And as a manager, I've been focused on negotiating and reconciling the two parts of my body, the brain, the logical, the very functional part of me, which says this has to happen because of these reasons, and the heart and the emotional side of me, which says, oh, but I'm going to hurt their feelings, or going to be upset or something like that. But as a manager, I have to not necessarily turn the heart off a little bit, but explain to the heart why this has to happen and what the consequences of not doing this could be. I think that's what I'm hearing when we talk about this, when we reflect. It's what happens if I don't have this confrontation? What happens if this tough thing doesn't get discussed? What's the fallout for that for me or for other people? That's what's coming up for me.
Right. Well, I mean, the consequences of that are always going to be consequences of omission, meaning if I avoid saying the thing that needs to be said, if I avoid addressing the thing that needs to be said, it tends to fester in some sort of way, and then it blows up, and then there's some sort of compensation that has to happen
It'll
afterwards,
come
right?
back to
So
haunt me or something else.
correct. And this is like the typical thing that I work through with clients where it's like right now, how you are, like I said, I'm talking to the owner and he has his team that is managing. It's like, okay, well, all of these compensations that you do, whether you avoid the little things and then only address them when it's like a really big thing. Okay, well, now we've compounded a bunch of little things that have created a bigger problem that is now compensating resources to deal with that time, money, emotional, mental bandwidth to deal with it, right? All of these over time create profit and time leaks that could be reallocated towards like actual growth, right? So the shorter you can nip it in the bud, the faster we can iterate and move forward. Okay.
Yep.
Everybody understands that intellectually. And the solution to this is never an intellectual solution because we all get this. And if it was just a logical thing, oh yeah, okay, I got to look at it this way. Cool, I got it. The reality is this is actually an emotional capacity issue.
Yep.
Okay. My discomfort to say the direct, clear thing and be firm about it. Like you don't have to yell and crush anybody's spirits, like you said. But when I coach clients to be assertive, my definition of assertiveness is anything that's clear, direct, and firm. Okay. Because I need that assertiveness to also set boundaries. I need that assertiveness to expect a certain standard of performance. I need that assertiveness to quality, like to do quality assurance. I need that level of
Yep.
assertiveness to keep people accountable, none of which actually requires any sort of yelling or negativity.
Yep.
To be confident in that assertiveness simply requires the ability to be okay if other people aren't okay. Okay, that is more of like a, okay, I have to build the capacity within myself to simply be okay with the other person not being okay, with them falling, knowing that that is part of their process. Because sometimes that really is what's happening. They have to fall, they have to make the mistake in order to do this, or they have to face the consequences of not being up to par with whatever it is that they agreed upon. So anyway, I don't want to keep talking to you. Like, what's landing from all of that?
There are a couple of things that landed. There's the idea of compensation. Like once upon a time, I was in the National Ski Patrol. I'm not sure if you're a skier or a snowboarder or anything like that, but I did a lot of learning and a lot of education about the human body and physiology. What comes up for me is like when you get a cut, when you get a scab, the rest of the body compensates for that by sending blood to the area. That's why you bleed when you get a cut. And the bigger the cut, the more the body has to compensate to keep blood pressure at a certain point and to keep things going where they're supposed to be. If you are able to keep the blood from flowing, if you're able to put a band-aid on it, put some gauze on it, if you're able to stop the bleeding at all costs, put anything you can on it within reason, then you are able to mitigate most of the long-term problems. But if you don't, you just let it bleed out. Even if it's a slow bleed, you'll eventually bleed out, and the body has bigger fish to fry than the blood. Things will start shutting down. So I think that really clicked into place for me, especially when you use the word compensate. It's this give and take. What are the consequences? What's the compensation factor for if this thing does or doesn't happen? If I put a band-aid on this now and that band-aid is an engineer-sized band-aid, then so be it. In the sense that they're the ones who have to fix the problem. But if I don't, then it keeps bleeding, then we have to have tough conversations. I think that really stood out to me from what you just said. And the follow up from that as well is also like being okay with people not being okay. That's definitely also a thing interesting thing for me. I am naturally kind of a people pleaser. That's definitely an attitude of mine. And I've started to become more acquainted with the idea that like not everyone will agree with me on everything. Sometimes I'll say or do things people don't agree with. They might not know all the information that I have. They may know more than me. And I have to be okay with the fact that not everyone is going to like everything that I do. And that comes up for me now in the context of people management. My direct reports might not love what I'm saying or be jazzed about it, but that's the way it is.
Correct. So I'm glad that those things are landing for you. And this is kind of going back to the whole idea of like you got to own your 50% of it first,
Yes.
right? Which is the biggest distortion you're going to have, the biggest challenge you're going to have is actually the people-pleasing patterns that are inherently who your identity has been kind of set up to be. Okay. And what I mean by that,
Yep.
so again, just to give you context, so my definition of identity is anything we think, feel, and act.
Yep.
Cumulatively over time, that becomes who it is that we are in the world. Okay. That is very much dependent on your history. So things in your history that have happened to cause you to be who you are and act in the way that you do. People pleasing is one of the ways with which you, in the past, found some sort of security or safety. Okay.
Yep.
That is now a distortion in your ability to lead people, right? One of the things I always say is like, you can't be a people pleaser and a people leader. They tend to go against each other. This doesn't mean you need
Okay.
to be mean with people, because that's also not going to work. But it's just like it's going to come against you to be a people pleaser if what is required out of my business or my job is to actually lead people. Why? Because people pleasing by default, how people pleasers find safety and security is they essentially internally optimized for being liked. It is very hard to be liked when you are delivering things that are effective. This is what you need to change. This is where there was a gap between what you promised and what was delivered. This is the gap between, what we said and what was delivered. Like all of those things, setting boundaries, saying no, right? Rejecting people's ideas, like all of those things fall into the category of effectiveness. And you can be effective and still not be, like you said, crushing of somebody's dream. But that internal like dichotomy that you were talking about between like the heart and the mind, that's effectively an emotional optimization problem. And like, am I optimizing for being liked or am I optimizing for being effective? And it generally runs subconsciously, right? Which is why I obviously I'm a big fan of like, okay, how do I improve my communication and the processes around it? It's all important. but it's only ever going to be as good as the inputs. And right now, like the major input is always going to be the leader themselves.
Yep.
So again, what lands for you with all of that?
I heard the word effective, which makes me think of like decisive, like knowing what it is that they want and being firm, not necessarily overly difficult or obstinate about what they want, but justifying it or explaining themselves and communicating their will or acting their will out onto everybody else. Like one example is recently, and this also ties into like it's okay if I screw up and admit to it. It's that's a way of building trust and autonomy too. We're going through some engineering stuff right now where like I made a decision about like a design pattern we did for a part of the platform. And I did the homework, I did the research. I said this is the way that I think we should do this particular part of the platform, like this page or whatever. One of my engineers came and said, "Oh, we might want to look into something else or this other way." I'm like, "Oh, I already did the homework. I spent a couple of hours on it. I think this is gonna be the way to go." We get into it, and there's some problems with it. It doesn't go perfectly, and I just kept it. And I'm like, "Yeah, you were right. Sorry." And then the opposite also happened earlier than that. Someone came to me with an architecture proposal. I'm like, "Oh, have you thought about these caveats? Oh, don't worry, it'll be fine." It didn't be end up being fine. And I had to come to them and say, like, okay, so we missed this pretty big hole in the design. How can we avoid it in the future? What comes up for me from what you were saying is that notion of being decisive, of committing to something, even if not everybody agrees with it, but then also recognizing the follow up from what happens if it doesn't work or doesn't go the way we thought it would, and being able to learn from our mistakes in that regard, being okay with falling off the bike or having a cut on your arm and then saying, okay, what are we going to do about it? I think that's what comes out of that's what comes to my mind from your idea of being effective.
Yeah, and I think those are good examples of showing that. So I'm glad that those like those connections are kind of popping into mind as I reflect this back. Again, when I'm working with clients on this, and this was actually something that I kind of came up together with a client. So shout out to my client Hutton for this. This mental model of TIE. Okay, this is an acronym for truth, immediacy, and effectiveness. So basically, when these situations pop up, you run them through this filter of TIE. So what is my immediate truth? So right now, I know this is, to the best of my knowledge, the right course of action. This is the thing that needs to be done. This is the thing that needs to be called out. This is my truth of the moment as I understand it with the data that I have.
Mhm,
Okay. The immediacy piece is how immediately am I actively delivering that truth? So we talk
mhm,
about those compensations. Generally, the need for the compensations happens because of the avoidance, right? The immediacy ends up getting lost because we get lost in the emotions of, "Oh, I don't know if I should say this," like all of the people pleasing stuff we talked about, right? But when you increase your capacity to actually be with, like, be okay with the other person not being okay and knowing that at the end of the day, it doesn't mean anything about you. It's a kind of a growth process for both people. Then I can deliver the truth that I know with as much immediacy as possible with the focus on effectiveness. So whatever it is that the situation calls for, I can deliver my truth as immediate as possible, not to optimize for being liked and kind of give into my people pleasing tendencies, but actually for effectiveness, right? And one other filter that often comes up in my coaching is this idea of separating the drama from the data. So all of those internal things, like you said, like the freaking out internally of like, am I going to be liked? Is this the right way? Am I going to crush their dreams? That is all of the drama that our past, that our identity is actually adding to the mix. When I can separate, or to the best degree that I can separate that drama from the data, what does the situation objectively call for in order to be effective? That cumulatively becomes kind of the heuristic for making decisions around the communication piece, the accountability piece, etc. Like there's many different ways with which you can kind of use that whole thing. So again, what comes up for you with that?
The first thing that comes to my mind is like you get a cut on your body, that is immediate. The body knows barring a disease or illness or something that's happening in your body, as soon as you get that big cut, the body immediately starts to compensate. And maybe the compensation isn't super obvious or noticeable. If it's a small cut, you just have to compensate by that much. So there's a little bit of blood that's going in to fill up the cut to cause some blood clotting, and then you're okay. With a big cut, with something really severe, the body has to compensate quickly, hard, and fast to get things as close to normal as possible. The problem with humans on the other side is that with humans, we can sometimes delay the execution of that immediacy. We can have a tendency to wait a little bit, to get a little bit antsy or unsure. Is this the best thing that I could be doing? Is this the best way to approach this problem, to do it, to actually, to not use the other metaphor, but it's in my mind already, to rip off the band-aid and say, okay, here's the problem. Here's the cut we got to take care of. Let's let the blood clot and let's get it over with at this point. And that does come to my mind as an engineering leader, engineering manager. It's how soon after this do I need to deal with it? How quickly do I need to respond to it? What happens if I am quick about it? What happens if I'm not? And what are the pros and cons of each kind of direction? And that really came to my mind. It's the immediacy of responding to something. Do I pop into somebody's Slack or Teams as soon as something is a minute or two late? Do I check in on them a little bit afterwards? Do I wait longer than that based on circumstances? And then kind of the degree to which I do so. Am I blowing up their phone? Am I waiting for them on Slack? Do I schedule a message for tomorrow morning or an email? What's the full blown volume, I would say, of the actual follow through? I think the timing and volume are huge parts of that conversation. And that's really what I landed from that.
Yeah. And again, that's going to be a process thing that's very unique to how you guys do your thing. So yeah, I think that's always kind of when it gets very personalized. But yeah, I'm glad that all those other pieces land for you. So just in terms of, 'cause I want to be conscious that we stay on track with regards to time, like anything else that's left outstanding for you, or is this kind of good as a primer on kind of the original issue that you came to this podcast with?
I feel a lot more confident about that. I think the only other thing that comes to my mind, I would say, is thinking a little bit about like what happens if this doesn't work out? Because there are going to be some people who all these things work great in a vacuum. When we as humans operate the way that we normally do 90% of the time. But people can have bad days. They can be in bad places in time. They can have a lot going on. There's a lot of reasons, valid reasons why someone might not be behaving rationally the way you expect them to. And this hasn't happened to me often. It's happened to me maybe a handful of times where I have had to have tough conversations, and I've had a lot of pushback or had to react very negatively. And I don't want to discredit the fact that those things are rare, but could happen. What would you say I should think about as I keep my own cool, keep my own temper as I approach a situation and I can see it's going poorly?
So I guess two clarifying details there. So like one, what tells you that it's going poorly? And then two, what is it? Because you mentioned, okay, I'm staying calm. So like, are you asking how do I remain calm and not lose myself? Like, I guess give me a little bit more clarity on what is the actual problem that you're experiencing.
As being a neurodivergent person, I've had to like do a lot of learning, a lot of observation and understanding of things like body language, tone, emotion, speech, and understanding how somebody is feeling based on my interactions with somebody. So generally, I can sense when something or someone isn't going the way that I think it has to. Like their body slumps, they look away, their tone drops. That's the sort of thing that I've started to notice more and more as my time being a leader and
Even if we
doing a
just,
lot of.
and I apologize for like interrupting you there because you said, okay, it's not going how it's supposed to, and then you describe essentially
Sorry,
somebody being down. So
clar-
how is
sorry.
it supposed to be going?
I think what's coming up for me, or what I think my issue necessarily is like how do I respond in those situations? At this point, every situation I've had where someone pushes back is kind of different.
Hmm.
Sometimes I'll be like, okay, like take a deep breath, I'll check with you later. And sometimes I check with them later to feel a lot better. Sometimes when it happens, they don't want to talk about it at all. Zip, nada. Sometimes it's very deflective. There's a lot of blame, there's a lot of accusations thrown around.
Hmm.
And I feel like every time is a little bit different. When someone's very the word that comes to my mind is argumentative. When someone is deflecting in these conversations, deflecting rather than reflecting, is there something that I should keep in my mind going into all these conversations? Because I feel like every one of them that I've had are so different from the next that it feels like it's kind of impossible to be prepared for that possibility going into it, other than to just kind of be ready for anything.
Sure. And if I did ask you that question again, how is it supposed to be? What would be your answer?
In a perfect world, if I knew I was going into a conversation that I knew was going to end poorly, I would seek to understand where that person was coming from and then take that into my control, my 50%, to understand what are they saying to me and what can I do about it? How can I respond? And then pose it back to them. Maybe they saw things through a different lens and I can control or influence or correct things that they saw which didn't reflect reality or things that they experienced that were untruthful or exaggerations or something else is going on. If I could have it the way I wanted it, it would ideally be to understand where they're coming from and resolve the discrepancies between what they're saying and what reality is. Not necessarily what I feel, but what actually happened.
And if you did that, what would be the result?
I couldn't promise it would get it back to exactly the way I wanted it to from square one, but I could at least get them to a point where we can have a constructive dialogue and reduce the temper, reduce the temperature.
And if you were able to do that, how would you feel?
I would feel a lot more confident in myself to handle a situation like that in the future and confident in the other person for being able to resolve a tense situation.
Okay. So would it be accurate to say you would feel relief?
Yes.
Okay. So that's an important one because, going back to that whole framework of am I optimizing for being liked or am I optimizing for being effective? Okay. So when you started this whole thing and kind of why I interrupted you wasn't so that I could cut you off. It was just when there's like yellow flags or red flags that pop up in the terminology that people use, like I'll just oftentimes I kind of like zoom into
Yeah.
to that scenario. So when you started speaking about that, there was a sense of, well, people can show up in a whole host of different ways in their negative reactions to whatever it is that I'm delivering. Okay.
Yep.
Part of me in those instances is seeking just relief from the tension of the negative situation, which is natural. Like you don't want to be in negative
Yeah.
situations all the time. Like they're not fun. Like, that's why they're negative situations. So this whole sense of like I'm searching for what is it that I need to say in order to have the other person be okay. So a part of me can get relief and kind of like make the situation okay. Okay. I'm not saying that's necessarily a bad thing to aim for, but if it's the primary thing or the subconscious thing that drives the conversation, then essentially you're going to be driving the conversation from a place of how can I make the person be okay versus deliver the thing that needs delivering while also respecting that there's a human on the other side and I just need to let them have their own experience, even if their own experience is one that might be an overreaction to the situation. Like in many ways,
Yeah.
that actually is their own stuff. It actually has nothing to do with you. And it's easier said than done to separate that. But that's kind of that whole element of separating the drama from the data.
Yeah.
Okay. So before I go on, what lands there, what doesn't?
I think there's a couple big differences between them being okay, them being okay with me, and them being okay with the situation. Talking about people pleasing, I'm not exactly looking for them to be okay with me. Like, they can be mad at me, upset at me for delivering the news, or being the bearer of bad news, or whatever the form is. They may not like me or what I have to say, and that's just a fact, and I have to be okay with that. They may not be okay in the outcome or aftermath of this conversation. It may be difficult, it may be challenging. Who knows how they're going to feel? It might not be great. What's most important for me and what comes up the most is they have to have some sort of peace or acknowledgement of the situation, a scenario that was created. And whether or not they take responsibility for it, what's important is at least acknowledging it and me seeing that acknowledgement. That goes back to people pleasing versus people leading. I can't necessarily guarantee that they're going to like me or what's going on, but they need to understand the why, the breadcrumbs, the paper trail, which got to this point, whether it was good or bad. And that's what I took away from what you just said there. It's relying less on the emotion and more on the facts, the objectivity of it all.
Correct. And it's actually on them, like you said, to take the responsibility for it. And as a leader, it's on you on how you're going to respond if they do or don't show you that they are taking ownership and responsibility, right? This is like one way to look at boundaries is not about controlling the other person. It's actually, what am I going to do if you change nothing about your behavior, right? So if you look at sports,
I have to compensate for it. You swap it in another player.
well, if you don't set boundaries and then subsequently referee them, you do have to compensate,
Yeah.
right? But if you look at sports, especially team sports, like everybody knows the rules. And all of the players are constantly trying to push against the edge of those rules. They're always trying to get an advantage through it. If there wasn't a referee there, like there's no point in having the rules and the boundaries and deciding what's in play. It's only once what is a boundary that's been set and agreed upon has been violated, do the boundaries actually matter, because then there's somebody to referee them and subsequently put in some sort of consequence.
Yeah.
So what you're describing in that instance is like, okay, am I explicit in what I'm delivering? And I'm okay with them not being okay with hearing that. But the part that's mine is once that's been delivered, it is actually on me to honor my own self accountability to the boundaries and the consequences of what's going to happen if they don't take the ownership that they have agreed upon or nodded to, or whatever the thing actually is. So that's more of a, how do I have assertiveness with myself in refereeing the boundaries that I actually set?
That's important. I think of like referee versus a coach. I do see the media engineering manager, the leader, as more of a kind of a referee and a coach. Like telling, I feel like it's more not like an NFL or NBA, NBA referee or coach. Those guys are in the big leagues. I say myself as much more of like a little league or minor league coach because those guys do a lot of the rule teaching, a lot of the education, a lot of the hand holding supportiveness of here's how you play, here's how you do it, kind of showing them the ropes and trusting it to let it go, dealing with temper tantrums, dealing with kids who maybe they lose the game, they missed a pitch, they didn't catch the ball, whatever it was. I see myself as more like a little league coach than I do the coach of the Mets, for instance. The coach of the Nets, he hired the players to do their job. They know what they're doing, and maybe every once in a while they'll mess up. But for the most part, he doesn't have to worry about them breaking the rules too much. I think I loved your analogy. I really think I'm more of like a little league coach.
Yeah, and I mean that depends on the stage that your team members are at,
Of
right? So like
course.
in my processes, it's like there's a distinction between onboarding somebody, which is like they're just getting like they know the basics of how to like operate within your space. Training, which is like, are they getting the knowledge and the skills to actually like do the job? Okay.
Yep.
Then there's like the maturing where like, okay, now we've iterated long enough and they're like getting good and reliable and essentially profitable to like create the leverage that's needed in the business. Like I can plug them in somewhere and the ROI of them and their output is going to be higher than what I have to pay for them. So that it's like three stages to kind of get there. And then there is the growth aspect, which is what you mentioned about like I want to nurture my team to like, so
Feel
it's like,
autonomy.
well, yeah, but it's like that piece is also shown by the individual. So you're not trying to help people that don't actually want to be helped, meaning I'm not trying to force somebody into a role that they don't necessarily want to be in, but it's like those are all very distinct stages, that different things. So it's like what you were describing is more in the onboarding, training, potentially growth stages. That's not going to be in sorry, the maturing stages. It's not going to be in the growth stages,
Yeah,
right? So it's like, yeah, your role as the leader has to shift. And again, that also depends on how big the organization is, etc. Um, so yeah, I mean, I don't know if that answers your question, but it's just like it's different stages for different people.
it helps a lot. I think that certainly is not a explicit solution, but there really isn't one to this question. But I think we answered it as best we could. We
Yeah,
addressed it as best we could, and I appreciate that.
awesome. So yeah, I mean, I know we're kind of out of time, but does that help clear up a lot of this stuff, or like, might there be anything else that's outstanding for you?
I feel a lot more confident about this. Confidence is what I was looking for coming into this, and now I feel a lot better. I feel ready for whatever's coming next, and I really appreciate this conversation that we had, and I appreciate the coaching.
Awesome. Well, I'm glad that that all landed for you. So, yeah, feel free to let everybody know where to find you, who's the best person to find you. Like, floor is yours for all that.
I am Shea Belsky, Shea, B as in boy, Elsky. You can find me on LinkedIn. There's only one of me. You can follow me there. That's why I post a lot of stuff about neurodiversity, leadership, autism. If that stuff interests you, definitely give me a follow or a connection on LinkedIn. And you can find me there and also elsewhere on the web too.
Awesome. Love it. Was as always, we'll include that in the show notes. But Shay, thank you very much for coming on. And for everybody else, we'll see you on the next one.
Brasco, thanks so much. See you all soon.